On the morning of Friday, December 5, 1952, London woke up to fog. This was not unusual. London had been waking up to fog for centuries. The city had a word for it, pea super, and most Londoners had long since made their peace with the yellow-grey murk that descended on the city in winter. You navigated around it. You dressed for it. You got on with your day. By nightfall on December 5, people were creeping along the sides of buildings with their hands on the walls. They could not see their own feet. By the time it lifted 4 days later, thousands of people were dead. Thousands more would follow in the months after. And the government, which knew, or should have known, exactly what was happening, spent the next 2 years insisting it wasn't as bad as it looked. This is the story of the Great Smog of London, 1952. One of the most deadly environmental disasters in British history. And one of the most extraordinary examples of institutional denial in the face of mass death. Let's get into it. Hi guys, welcome back. Okay, so I need to give you something before we get to December 1952. Because the Great Smog didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end point of a story that had been building for centuries. And understanding that build-up is what makes what the government did, and didn't do, in the aftermath so genuinely maddening. London had been choking on its own air since the 13th century. Seriously. Coal was being burned in London by the 1200s, and complaints about the smoke it produced appear in records going back that far. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, the situation was already desperate. Charles Dickens described London's air. Arthur Conan Doyle described it. The fogs that appear in Victorian literature, sinister, suffocating, hiding crime and misery, were not literary invention. They were documentary observation. The fog of Victorian London was real, and it was toxic. In 1905, a public health scientist named Harold Antoine de Vaux finally gave the specific combination of smoke and fog a name. He combined the two words together. Smog. By 1952, London had been suffering smog events, pea supers, for decades. Most people had accepted them as a feature of London life. Unpleasant, yes. Inconvenient, certainly. Occasionally associated with spikes in respiratory illness and death. But part of the deal. The price of industrial civilization. What nobody fully understood, what the government had not taken seriously enough to act on, was that the combination of conditions that descended on London in December 1952 was not a pea super. It was something of a completely different order. Let me set the scene for you properly. Winter 1952 was bitterly cold. London had been cold since November, heavy snowfalls, freezing temperatures, the kind of winter that drives people indoors and keeps them there. And in 1952, indoor meant coal fire. Central heating was rare. The coal fire was the primary heating source for most London homes, most offices, most buildings. And here is a specific detail that I think is one of the most important facts in this entire story. The coal that London was burning in December 1952 was not good coal. Britain, in 1952, was still paying off the enormous debt of World War II. The economy was under significant strain. And one of the ways the government managed this strain was by exporting the higher quality, lower polluting coal, anthracite, hard coal that burned more cleanly, to generate export revenue. What Londoners burned in their fireplaces was the cheap stuff. A low-grade, highly sulfurous coal called nutty slack, similar to lignite. It burned poorly. It produced enormous quantities of smoke and sulfur dioxide. And in December 1952, with temperatures near freezing, Londoners were burning it in unprecedented quantities. On top of that, London had multiple coal-fired power stations operating within the city boundaries, Battersea, Bankside, Fulham, Greenwich, and others, all adding their output to the air above the city. A fleet of new diesel buses had recently replaced London's electric trams, adding diesel exhaust to the mix. Steam locomotives still ran through the city's rail lines, adding more. The city was producing an extraordinary volume of airborne pollution on a perfectly ordinary December day. And then, on December 4th, an anticyclone arrived. An anticyclone is a high-pressure weather system. In a normal winter, pollution from coal fires rises into the cold air and disperses. But when an anticyclone settles over a city, it creates a temperature inversion. A layer of warm air sits on top of the cold air below, effectively putting a lid on it. The cold air, and everything mixed into it, cannot rise. Cannot disperse. Cannot go anywhere. It just sits there. And accumulates. On the evening of December 4th, this lid went on over London. The smoke from hundreds of thousands of coal fires, the output of the power stations, the diesel exhaust, the steam locomotives, all of it was now trapped in a layer of cold air 100 to 200 meters deep over the city. When that cold, polluted air met the moisture in London's damp atmosphere, fog formed. Not the ordinary London fog. Something else. Something that turned yellow. Then yellow-brown. Then nearly black in some places. Each day during the 5 days of the smog, the following were being emitted into that trapped layer of air: 1,000 tons of smoke particles. 370 tons of sulfur dioxide, which combined with the moisture in the air to form 800 tons of sulfuric acid. 140 tons of hydrochloric acid. 14 tons of fluorine compounds. Sulfuric acid. In the air. That people were breathing. The smog settled on London like a blanket on December 5th, and by that evening, it was unlike anything the city had experienced in living memory. In the Isle of Dogs, people could not see their own feet. Not reduced visibility, zero visibility. Blackness at knee height. A young doctor named Donald Atchison, working a shift at a hospital in central London, stepped outside to run an errand and immediately became lost on streets he knew intimately. He later described having to creep on the pavement along the walls of the buildings, to the next corner, to read the name of the street. He navigated by touch, his hands on the building facades, reading street signs at corners. Policemen on traffic duty used flares to guide buses through intersections. Buses moved at walking pace, conductors walking ahead of them to prevent them driving off the road. The London Underground became extraordinarily crowded as surface transport ground to a halt. At Smithfield Market, where prize cattle had been brought to London for the annual agricultural show, animals began to die. Cattle choked to death in their pens. Their lungs filled with sulfuric acid. Veterinarians performed emergency procedures, wrapping oxygen masks around the animals' faces. Most died anyway. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, a production of La Traviata was abandoned midway through the first act. The smog had penetrated the building. The audience could not see the stage. Ambulances stopped running. Ambulance crews could not navigate. People who needed emergency medical attention were being brought to hospitals by strangers who were feeling their way through the dark by touch. And across London, in tens of thousands of homes and bedsits and tenements, elderly people, infants, and anyone with pre-existing respiratory conditions were quietly beginning to die. Their airways inflaming. Their lungs filling. The bronchitis and bronchopneumonia that would kill them developing hour by hour in their chests, as outside their windows the air grew thicker and more toxic and the city fell silent. The smog lifted on December 9th. The anticyclone moved on. The wind returned. The yellow-black lid over London dispersed. And London, mostly, carried on. The newspaper headlines had been calm throughout. Fog blanketed London all today, the Evening Standard had reported on December 5th, dispassionately. By the worst days, coverage was more alarmed, but the basic frame was still, unusual weather, disruption, inconvenience. The word disaster was not being used. Then the registrar's figures arrived. In the weeks after the smog, as the mortality records were tallied, it became clear that something extraordinary had happened. Approximately 4,000 people had died in excess of normal mortality rates during the 5 days of the smog. The funeral industry had completely run out of coffins. Florists had run out of flowers. Crematoria were running day and night. The death rate had reached levels not seen since the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919. 4,000 people. In 5 days. In London. In peacetime. And the government's response was to suggest that most of them had probably died of influenza. Now guys. I want to be precise here. Because the government's handling of this is genuinely extraordinary and I don't want to mischaracterize it. The conservative government of Winston Churchill was not, as far as the historical record shows, engaged in a formal cover-up of the kind where officials sat in rooms deciding what to suppress. It was something both more mundane and in some ways more disturbing than that. It was a government that did not want to accept the implication of what had happened. Because the implication was clear, the burning of coal, in domestic fires, in power stations, in industry, had just killed 4,000 people in 5 days. And any meaningful response to that would mean regulating coal burning. Which would mean confronting the coal industry, and the economics of home heating, and the energy infrastructure of a country still rebuilding from a war. Harold Macmillan, who was housing minister at the time, and who would later become prime minister, wrote privately that he hoped the issue would be dropped. He suggested that the figures were being exaggerated. He recommended that the government resist pressure to act quickly. Winston Churchill said nothing publicly. Not a word. No statement. No acknowledgement that thousands of his citizens had just died from breathing the city's air. A preliminary government report attributed the deaths primarily to influenza. But an expert named E.T. Wilkins, who was the officer in charge of atmospheric pollution at the government's own Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, had been doing his own work. He plotted the excess death rates against pollution readings from December 1952 through March 1953. What he found was that the 4,000 figure was wrong, not because it was too high, but because it was too low. The smog had continued to kill people for months afterward. People who had survived the 5 days with damaged lungs, who developed bronchopneumonia or chronic respiratory conditions in the following weeks, who died in January and February and March of 1953. Another 8,000 deaths. Beyond the initial count. Making approximately 12,000 in total. Wilkins's chart, with its clear correlation between pollution levels and excess mortality, sat in government files. It was not acted upon immediately. It was not publicized. The government held the line. Influenza. Cold weather. These things happen. It took 2 years of sustained pressure, from doctors, from scientists, from journalists, from members of parliament who kept asking questions, before the government agreed to act. In 1954, the City of London Corporation banned smoke in the square mile. In 1956, Parliament finally passed the Clean Air Act, 4 years after 12,000 people died. The Clean Air Act of 1956 was genuinely transformative. It established smoke-free zones across urban Britain. It regulated coal burning in homes and factories. It required power stations to use cleaner fuels or move out of city centers. It offered financial incentives to households to switch from coal fires to gas or electric heating. The problem didn't disappear overnight. A second Clean Air Act was needed in 1968, but the direction of travel changed fundamentally. London today has none of the coal fire smog that characterized it for 700 years. The pea soupers are gone. The Victorian murk, the Dickensian fog, the thing that killed 12,000 people in December 1952, all of it is gone. The air above London is incomparably cleaner than it was in December 1952. But it took 4 years from the disaster to the legislation. And the full death toll, the 12,000 figure, was not officially confirmed until a scientific reassessment in 2004. 52 years after the event. Among the dead, if you want a single name to hold the human scale of what happened, Charles Herbert Lightoller. He was 78 years old. He had survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, he was the most senior surviving officer. He had survived the rescue operation at Dunkirk in 1940, when he took his private motor yacht across the channel to help evacuate soldiers from the beaches. He survived two of the defining catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century. And then, in December 1952, the air in his city killed him. That is the specific, human weight of what the Great Smog of London was. Not a natural disaster. Not an unforeseeable accident. A predictable consequence of decisions, about what coal to burn, about where to put power stations, about how to balance industrial economics against public health, that had been made for decades, and that the government, when confronted with their lethal consequence, chose to minimize and delay acknowledging. The legacy of the Great Smog extends beyond London. The Clean Air Act of 1956 became a model for environmental legislation worldwide. Countries that had been developing their own industrial air pollution, the United States, Germany, Japan, looked at what Britain had done and built their own equivalents. The smog of 1952 is, in a very real sense, the origin point of modern environmental law. Which is both something to be grateful for and something to sit with uncomfortably. It took 12,000 dead people to produce that legislation. And even then it took 4 years. The question that lingers, the one I find the most difficult, is not, why did this happen? We know why it happened. We can list the causes precisely, the coal, the anticyclone, the power stations, the diesel buses. The question is, why did it take 4 years? Why, when the evidence was clear, when E.T. Wilkins had his chart, when the funeral parlors had run out of coffins, when the cattle at Smithfield were dead in their pens, why did it take 4 years and sustained political pressure to pass a law that might have prevented it? The answer, I think, is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable. Because the people making the decision about whether to act were not the people dying from the air. And the interests of the coal industry, and the post-war economy, and the Conservative government's political relationship with both, weighed more heavily in Whitehall than the deaths of 12,000 Londoners. That is not ancient history. That dynamic, where the people who suffer the consequences of environmental decisions are not the people making them, is not something that ended in 1952. On December 5, 1952, Londoners woke up to fog. They were used to it. They had always been used to it. The city had a word for it and a certain dark pride in its atmospheric distinctiveness. By December 9, when the fog lifted, 4,000 of them were already dead. By the following spring, the real number would be 12,000. And for 2 more years, the government would talk about influenza. The smog is gone now. London's air is clean by comparison, transformed by legislation that came, as so much legislation does, too late for the people it should have protected. But the 12,000 are still 12,000. And the 4 years are still 4 years. And E.T. Wilkins's chart, the one that showed the spike in deaths, the correlation with pollution, the 8,000 additional deaths that were attributed to influenza, sat in government files while the people who might have acted on it decided that other considerations mattered more. Okay guys. That is the story of the Great Smog of London 1952. What do you think? Was the government's response negligence or deliberate suppression? Does it change anything for you that it took a disaster of this scale to produce environmental legislation that protected millions of people afterward? And what do you make of the fact that the full death toll wasn't officially confirmed until 2004, 52 years later? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of question I want to sit with you on. If this video was worth your time, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Turn on notifications. And I'll see you in the next one.